Hello, my name is Gil Penalosa, and this is Cities for Everyone, the webinar, where every other week I invite fascinating guests to share the stories that will help all of us create more equitable, sustainable, and playful cities. Originally, I'm from Bogota, Colombia, where I led the construction of over 200 parks, and most of them were in areas of extreme poverty, which is one of the reasons why I'm so eager to learn today about favelas. I've been living in Canada now for 25 years, and 18 years ago, I created the nonprofit 880 Cities. Our guest today is Theresa Williamson with a master's and a PhD from University of Pennsylvania. She went to Brazil, to Rio, to work on the favelas in 2002 and stayed there. She has a fascinating story to tell. I met her as we both were teaching at Norman Foster's Institute on his program on sustainable cities. And I love her presentation and her experience and what she's doing with her organization. So I invited her, and she was so kind to accept. Theresa, welcome. Okay, Theresa Williamson, how are you?
Great, Gil. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's so nice to have you. Teresa is originally was born in Brazil, but went to the US when she was a very little girl. Afterwards, she ended up doing a master's in urban planning at UPenn and went to work in the favelas in 2002, and now she stayed there. So she has a long history. She's going to tell us a little bit about herself. I met her because both of us were sharing ideas, both of us as some of you know, I'm one of the chairs at the Norman Foster Institute on the Sustainable Cities program. And that's where I met Theresa. And I was so impressed with her and the work that she does. And I said, it will be really, really interesting for other people to learn. So basically, everyone is here to listen to you. So tell us a little bit about yourself and about the favelas and about sustainability.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gil, for that introduction. I'm seeing there are Brazilians in the audience. Bem-vinda, Vanessa. I wanted to also just say that it's an honor to be here with 880 Cities. I think that the parallels we've reached as planners, that cities should be built around we should be, as planners, thinking about the most vulnerable at the core of planning, and then we're planning effectively for everyone, is the same conclusion. And with our organization, that's those most vulnerable communities in our context in Rio are the favelas. So I'm going to share some slides here. I should mention that Catalytic Communities, so the nonprofit that I'm going to talk about and from which I bring my experience, was the subject of my PhD thesis at Penn. So I did both a master's and a PhD in planning at Penn. And then I've been implementing this work ever since 2000, since the organization was founded. And also I should mention that so this is 24 years now of sort of built experience from a very grassroots perspective. So I'm going to try to keep it to 25 minutes, but know that I'm just going to scratch the surface of these subjects. So if you're interested in learning more, first of all, I've shared the link to the presentation in the chat, and you can go ahead and look at it in more detail whenever you like, click on the videos and so on. And there are also some hidden slides that you can access through the link. But also reach out to me. That's my email address, so that we can extend this conversation a bit more. So my talk today is entitled Sustainable Favelas, the Key to Climate Justice and Thriving Cities. We're going to talk sort of in three sections. I'm going to introduce Rio's favelas, which are Brazil's informal settlements, right? I'm going to reintroduce them from the vantage point, from the perspective of our organization that works closely with grassroots partners. I'll give you a quick overview of our organization, Catalytic Communities, and then I'll share the sustainability initiatives that are incredibly inspiring, that are happening in these communities, that are multiplying without very many people being aware of them, and that can be models really for not only informal settlements, but communities around the world. So it's quick. I'm not going to be able to see your reactions, right? So I just ask you to reflect on who lives in a country with informal settlements. You can see from this map that it's really the majority of countries have informal settlements. And if you look at statistics, 1 in 3 people today in cities lives in informal settlements, and the UN actually predicts that a third of all humanity, urban and rural, will live in them by 2050. So this is where human population growth is happening in our lifetimes. And we typically think of these as problematic, right? Of course, there are problems associated with them. There are enormous challenges. Nobody is going to deny any of that. But that's really overlooking a lot of elements about these communities when we just take this overarching narrative that these are horrible places that need to be removed, that shouldn't exist. The reality is they're here, and the reality is they're actually how cities developed historically. They were built based on local resources, materials, what you could build with the human, without machines, without by neighbors. So informal settlements really are just the primary way people have built cities historically and present day. And so when I talk about them, I want you, wherever you are in the world, whatever your experience is with these communities, to try to, obviously, I'm going to bring Rio very much to center because we have a very specific local context that I want to share. But that's also so that people can think about the fact that these are very unique neighborhoods. And in every city, they're responding to historical factors and local factors. And so when we have this broad terms like slums or squatters or shanties, and we look at, like, again, a third of urban humanity, and we just stamp this pejorative term on these neighborhoods, we're really overlooking not only what they are ultimately, but what they could contribute, what they contribute. And so I'm going to, again, pull out and talk about Rio specifically. When people think of Rio, when you think of the postcard images of Rio, you don't see favelas in those. But if you visit Rio, you will see favelas everywhere. In the middle of the South Zone, across the North Zone. When you look at maps of the city's favelas, they are all over the urban fabric, very different from many cities where informal settlements are on the fringes. In Rio, they are everywhere, and that's due to specific historical factors. The first community, called the Favela, was founded in 1897. Today, it's called Providencia. It still has that original blueprint 130 years later. And it was called Favela, named after this robust, spiny bush you see in the top right of the image, which is a plant that soldiers, former enslaved Brazilians, who had been freed less than a decade earlier, they were recruited into the Brazilian army in the 1890s, and they fought a very bloody battle called Canudos, and the government promised to pay those who survived in land. So they came to Rio, the capital, and they went waiting for their land, and they were never paid. So they settled this hill, and they called it Favela Hill, affectionately after the plant from the hillsides where they had served battle. So the term favela is not pejorative in and of itself. It's not negative in and of itself. And increasingly, residents of favelas are claiming it as a strong point. And I'll talk a little bit about the evolution of how these communities see themselves. This is a slide with a lot of text that I'm not going to read all of it. And there are going to be others like this, but they're really important points that you can come back to later. I'll just summarize this very important point, which is the favelas have been around in Rio now for 130 years. They're multi-generational communities, and they're a territorial manifestation of that legacy of slavery in Brazil. Brazil actually had the largest slave trade in history, and Rio was the largest point of entry for enslaved Africans. And we actually sped up the slave trade after most of the world abolished slavery in the 1800s. So it's a very recent history, and it's very much stamped across the urban fabric. The favelas across Rio, when you do racial maps of the city, they're identical to the maps of the favelas. So this is a fundamental way to understand the city, and then to also understand why we've had these policies of neglect and repression towards these communities since they were founded. So these are not new settlements. These are often historic settlements. And we have these sort of policies ever since of neglect and repression. And so that's sort of the outside in perspective. But then you have to remember there are people on the ground in these communities. And while the government is instituting policies of neglect and repression, people are building their communities, and they're rebuilding their communities over time. and their communities are adapting to their needs over time. And so now, all these decades later, you have an incredibly diverse and rich and interesting urban fabric in favelas that needs to be recognized so that they can be fully integrated, and reparations can be addressed, but in a way that actually recognizes all that's been built by residents. And all of this has resulted in 1.4 million people, about 24% of the city, living in favelas. So here's a few images of favelas today. This is actually Providencia, again, the first favela. This is the view from it over downtown Rio. This is Rocinha, which is the largest favela in Rio, which is more urbanized and considered a formal neighborhood, even though they are also considered a favela. This is Indiana, which is a community that's been historically underserved, and you can see the lack of public infrastructure. You can see here in Rocinha the cables, so you don't have sufficient high quality. These are put in by the electrical utility. This is an important misnomer. People often think, oh, people in the favelas are siphoning electricity. That does happen. But what also happens is that utility doesn't properly provide service. They don't provide quality service. Same thing with water, where residents have to do it for themselves. And then if you also, again, keep this lens of looking at this history of slavery in Brazil, and you think about the fact that these communities in the Latin American context, and this is where I think there may be a difference from Asia and African informal settlements, but here in Latin America, for many Afro-descendants, the favelas where they live and settle are the first claim to land that their families have had in many generations. And so there's an investment that people make in these communities, even in the absence of tenure rights or other types of rights. So you get a very robust and interesting urban fabric where people are able to create highly social environments, which is something us urban planners are trying to build into cities, right? A lot of pedestrian spaces, public spaces, a lot of cultural production in these communities, which those are some of the assets people are more aware of. And so what I'm trying to say through all of this is that a lot of the stigma just doesn't hold. Favela residents are not at fault for the predicaments that we associate with them, the negative stereotypes that we have of these communities. And so to sort of, before concluding this introduction to favelas, I want to share how our organization sees them over 20-some years of work with hundreds of neighborhoods across Rio and community leaders. So we see them as a solution to the unmet need for affordable housing, right? So they're basically neighborhoods that self-surface in order to meet the need for housing. There's no outside regulation, so this can be positive, but it can also create unique communities where, it can be negative, but it can also create unique communities where you have, because of the lack of zoning or other types of regulations. I'm not saying I'm in favor of that, because obviously you have safety standards that are an issue, but it's important to recognize that this is the way they've evolved. This is an aspect of them which may not necessarily be negative. They're built by residents for residents. So everything you see when you go in a favela was built by someone there. And there's something palpable, especially over communities that have become historic, where every single tile, every brick, everything that's in that space has this embedded history. And they're constantly evolving based on culture, access to resources, jobs, knowledge, and the city. So a favela in a hillside will have different circumstances than low-lying. The South Zone near tourism opportunities and jobs will be very different from the North post-industrial part of the city. When the community was settled, which immigrants came, what kind of leadership was established, all of those things over time have these ripple effects that lead to particularly complex and interesting neighborhoods. And so whereas they do start as squatters, they do start as shanties or slums, they actually evolve beyond those basic conditions that we associate with those. And it becomes a huge problem when we continue using those labels on communities that have invested historically in themselves in the context of constant neglect and repression. We really need to recognize what they've done despite those circumstances and support them in that development. And so there are many qualities that urban planners, like many of us here, are trying to build into our cities today that Rio's favelas have built organically. So we have affordable housing in central areas. We have responsive architecture based on people's needs. There's low social isolation in these communities. They're pedestrian-centered neighborhoods and so on. We have several here that I know 80 Cities works closely on, the whole focus on pedestrian spaces and bicycles, transit, mixed-use development, and so on. And then there's sociocultural assets, and these are the ones that people are more familiar with in favelas, because basically anything you associate with culture in Rio, whether it's Carnival or New Year's Eve, whether it's samba or passinho, these are all either created or developed or strengthened in Rio's favelas. They have a high play atmosphere for kids in these communities, strong solidarity networks, and so on. And these are a few of those images of the cultural manifestations of favelas that are very familiar to many people who have been to Brazil. And so that's my summary of favelas and how our organization, Catalytic Community, sees these communities. And now I'm going to talk very briefly about our organization, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A if you want. So these slides are kind of going to give a summary, but basically it's an organization created from the ground with local favela partners over 24 years now. Everything we do is to support grassroots organizers in favelas who are already doing the important work to build their communities. So this is a summary postcard of our work. We work to generate models for the effective community-led, people-centered development of these communities. We focus in Rio, but we dialogue with organizations around the world. At this point, we have 3 main programs at the moment, and you see them on the right there in this image. We have one, we actually started with what's closer to the Sustainable Favela Network, which is sharing community solutions. But when the pre-Olympic period came in Brazil and so many communities were threatened with eviction, we realized that the narrative was such a problem. And so the narrative we've just been talking about, it's so important to see these communities in a new light so that we can really integrate them and support them. And so we started a community reporting platform, which is represented by the red, which is called Rio on Watch. It was started at the time as Rio Olympics Neighborhood Watch, and it's a bilingual favela reporting website where the articles are written primarily by favela journalists. So we have community reporting work, which works on the narrative so we can understand these communities better. We have the Sustainable Favela Network, which I'm going to talk about in the rest of the presentation, which is a network of grassroots solutions to do sustainable development in favelas, right, to implement. And then we also have, which I won't talk about much now, but feel free to ask questions, the Favela Community Land Trust project, which is about addressing land rights in a way that allows communities to stay on their land, doesn't risk gentrification. So these are the 3 programs. You can kind of get an image of them. Rio on Watch on the left, it's our reporting platform. We articles about favela in Portuguese and English about favela issues. The Sustainable Favela Network, which is this network of hundreds of grassroots organizers in favelas that are working to solve local problems. And the Community Land Trust on the right, which is a model of land regulation where communities own the land collectively, but the housing belongs to the individuals. So we have these 3 postcards. Again, the presentation is in the chat. Feel free to look at these in more detail that talk about our reporting platform, the Sustainable Favela Network and its various working areas, and the Community Land Trust project. Oh, and finally, everything we do as an organization is based on the asset-based community development approach. This is an approach to community development, and I really think it can apply to individual development, any kind of development, but where you start with the assets, you start with the qualities. And it's especially important when we're talking about the vulnerable, when we're talking about the marginalized, to not go straight to the challenges and problems and act like there's nothing of quality there, because the truth is there are always many assets. And when we address the problems without identifying and protecting the assets, we can often dismantle qualities and assets in the process. You can think of many urban policies in informal or low-income neighborhoods around the world where they came in to address a problem and then they unraveled community qualities because they didn't take the time to identify them and make sure to protect them. So everything we do as an organization is in the right hand, asset-based community development approach, right? We start with what's working, we identify opportunities, we address the challenges based on those opportunities. It's very people-focused, right? The people that are there are not about land valuation, it's about people. So the last section of the presentation, we're gonna have a deep dive in some of the inspiring stories, inspiring projects that are happening in Rio's favelas. Beyond guaranteeing affordable housing, which is the main thing we've talked about, favelas really have been adapting to climate change for over a century. If you look at the history of these communities, some of the communities in Rio, they were literally settled in whatever land was available, or not even. Sometimes it was, wetlands. It was wherever they could find space. And so over time, these communities developed and their own technologies to adapt. And so we're able to stay. This is the same favela today, Complexo da Maré. It's the largest favela complex in Rio, with a couple 100,000 people living there. Morro do Salgueiro is famous for its samba carnival school, samba schools. Here on the left, you can see a historic rendition of what the community would have been like 70 years ago. This is Morro do Salgueiro today. It's a community that really values its cultural origins. And in fact, among other projects there, they have a group of herb growers who plant herbs all throughout the community, and they educate and work with residents so people can heal from those herbs. So those are just some examples historically, but this work that we've started was 12 years ago when we took the first sort of step, when the seed was planted for the Sustainable Favela Network officially. It was for the Rio Plus 20 Earth Summit, when we produced a film with 8 different community organizations, 50 different community organizations filled in our questionnaire asking, who wants to be involved with the film around sustainability for the UN conference on the environment in Rio. And again, 50 replied, 8 of them were selected based on the diversity. And we went and filmed, and the documentary was developed as from what was filmed, from what they wanted to share. And what we saw at the time was that these community organizations, community groups, and initiatives that were addressing sustainability, different from other community movements, didn't know each other. So the communications groups knew each other, the culture groups knew each other, but the favela-based sustainability initiatives, the agroforestry project, the community gardens, the community cleanup programs, they weren't connected in the same way. And so that was the seed when we made the film. And then we started sort of getting to know a lot of these different organizations on the ground who were doing cleanups, community co-ops for recycling, community organizations that work with adaptive reuse of materials, in this case to make drums and to teach drumming and music, community solar initiatives that exist in favelas, also more simplified solar for water heating. Water societies. There are favelas that are on the hills that actually collectively manage the water resources that come down from the mountain. Community greenhouses and individual gardens people have in their homes. Green roofs. So this is the Green Roof Favela project, where the community leader there is able to keep his home 15 degrees cooler Celsius in summer than the neighboring homes in the height of summer in Rio. So again, a lot of green projects. There's even solar water irrigation created by a community resident in a favela. A lot of environmental education projects across favelas. This is Yara of Alfazendo in City of God, who's an icon in this area. And so all of those initiatives I just shared, those were all just individual projects that were happening on the ground, and there are many more. And so we realized there is a vocation for sustainability and concerns around sustainable development in favelas already across these local leaders. So the Sustainable Favela Network was established to recognize and supercharge these grassroots projects. So what do we do if we all get together? So first year, 2017, we put out a big call and we mapped these initiatives. The second year, 2018, we did a number of exchanges in person, and then we launched the network at the end of the year at this event on the bottom right. In 2019, we formed our working groups on different themes, and we had open exchanges with 90, 100 people from all over the city coming to visit different sustainability initiatives. So it was very much about exchanges in the beginning. And then in 2020, when the pandemic came, we all were online. Well, we weren't all online. Many of the community leaders were literally on the front lines of COVID globally, because Brazil was one of the hardest hit countries and the favelas were the hardest hit areas. So we all collectively were meeting weekly online and providing different types of logistical support, doing live events online, doing fundraising campaigns for food staples, and also launching the COVID-19 in Favelas Unified Dashboard. So we did a lot of organizing around data, because the favelas weren't being reported in the COVID data as separate, even though we knew that they were most affected. So those were the projects we were doing those first 5 years, but then we also got an opportunity to create a large climate justice initiative. And so then we started implementing infrastructure. So we supported the finalization of a biosystem in a favela that treats their sewage. We did socio-environmental mobilization trainings. And then the next year, which was 2023, we did more of these exchanges around solar energy. We launched our climate memory exhibition, which you can see. Oh, you'll see more in a minute. And we also, oh no, I'm not sure I included that slide. Sorry about that. Anyway, if you access the presentation, you'll see it. But so these are all the different kinds of initiatives we are doing as a network. This is a slide that summarizes the network. Here you can see the objectives that I mentioned, where we have 11 thematic objectives that we work on, from climate justice and research and policy through local memory, food sovereignty, health, economy, and so on, all the way down to sustainable housing. And we work across these pillars, and in this order. The order is really important. So it's first and foremost, exchanges build unity and knowledge sharing. And it's about peer-to-peer learning, because favelas have solutions. We just need to support those solutions. Then we work on trainings, which includes both favela trainings, where community leaders bring their knowledge, but also where technical allies bring knowledge. So there's a lot of different workshops and trainings. There are infrastructure build outs so that we can show that favelas can be upgraded through green technologies. Then there's research to corroborate a lot of these things, but also to understand the context that we're working in. Communication of all of this, and advocacy. And advocacy essentially is an effect of all of this, because once you've built unity, once you've built knowledge, once you've built examples, models on the ground, once you've done the data, you've got the data, you have everything you need to advocate most effectively without co-optation and other threats that come from public officials at times, and so on. And so just kind of the next few slides sort of operationalize these bits. So you can see some of the exchanges that we have, where community leaders go and visit each other's communities to learn from each other. And so we do these public events together. And then you can see the trainings that we do. So in this case, on the bottom left, you're seeing a 6-month research program that we developed with a number of partners to train young people in water and energy research. And then they went into the field and conducted the research. We had the infrastructure build outs, which now have included a biosystem for sewage, solar infrastructure, and green roof technology. We have research, which often comes from the trainings. In this case, it's the water and energy justice research I mentioned earlier, but also the COVID dashboard. Oh, and the climate memory project. So actually the slide is here. I just realized it was over in this part of the presentation. So the climate memory project is a beautiful qualitative research program where community groups that work on memory, they host a one-day forum within their community. They bring together elders and activists and others who know the history of the community, and we document a full day of discussion circles where they identify the history, the climate history of the community, the solutions they've developed to climate challenges, and then it becomes an exhibition, which is now being strengthened and developed. So communication work includes obviously social media, it includes press and so on. And then finally, the advocacy, which has most recently taken us to Brasilia, to the capital of Brazil, to share data that communities collected themselves on energy access to try to get better access to energy and solar in favelas. So nature-based solutions abound as well as part of these. I know that's a lot of people are talking about nature-based solutions. There are many nature-based solutions as part of the network's activities. And I'm happy to go into more detail about these as well in the Q&A. And so just to conclude, because I'm wary of time, I want to be able to hear from all of you. Just the first point is we need to drop the double standards. You know, historically, cities were built informally. If you look at UNESCO designations for a number of historic towns, they use terms like they were given the status, the UNESCO status, because of the vernacular urban fabric adapted to the hillsides based on improvised urban design, right? These images in the top right and the bottom right are comparing Santorini to a favela in Rio. You can get a sense for how we just need to come to these communities with a new eye, fresh look, but also a community-based look. I'm not suggesting we look at them as future Santorinis. I'm suggesting we just drop the double standards. And then, you know, what if we invested in decentralized planning where communities control their destiny? And as technical folks, we are allies supporting that vision rather than experts. The experts are the community, especially when they've built themselves over generations. And what if we employed iterative, experimental, adaptive urban planning, right? Building small with communities, observing and evaluating the results, adjusting, adding, expanding, and multiplying by example rather than a centralized force. And finally, Rio could set an example for the world, right? I mentioned that the UN projects that a third of humanity will live in informal settlements by 2050. It's necessary that we come to these communities with a different lens. We need to think differently, and we need to do this fast. And so I just want to leave us with that and encourage you all to sign up for our publications online. And that's it. And thank you, Gil, again for this opportunity. And I'm looking forward to hearing from everybody.
Oh, and Theresa, thank you very, very much. And the last question we always ask our guests, what would be your call to action? You have people here from all around the world, from Kenya, from Chile, from Mexico, from all over the US. What would your call to action regarding sustainable favelas? You have people from public health and environment and parks. Some people are retired, some academics. What is it that we could do? What is the message that you want us to really leave very loud and clear? That a little bit of us that summarizes this amazing presentation that you have done.
I think try to take what we've talked about today and have a fresh look at your neighborhood, at your city, your communities, at your policies, at how we're engaging as planners in our context, and see if anything here resonates, can be applied. Think of things experimentally. We don't have to I talked about at the end of the presentation, it doesn't have to be these big master plans. As planners, we can be more iterative like favelas are. We learn a lot by doing things like that. Be more experimental. Let's try something, see if it works, try something else. I don't know, I think a lot of the methodology and the approach from favelas is what guides our organization. And we can all learn from all of those experiences. So I would say that that's what my call to action would be. It's not succinct, it's not a slogan, but yeah.
Wonderful. No, and I love it. It's not about slogans, but you spoke very clearly how people need to listen and learn and before coming down and trying to think that everybody has all of the actions, all of the solutions. And also it's not about a cookie cutter. Sometimes I see people that work in planning firms in Copenhagen and they go to a slum in Buenos Aires and they do exactly the same thing and say, oh, no, it's totally out of context, it's totally out of focus. But you have given us very good ideas and lessons on how to work with the community and the importance of citizen engagement, and also the importance of sustainability and how the creativity that comes within the people, even living in the very extreme circumstances, they value sociability, they value sustainability, and they are really creating a better world. I think that I truly enjoyed very, very much, Theresa. Thank you for having shared this. Have a wonderful day, Theresa, and everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Gil, so much. Bye. Ciao, ciao.
Theresa, thank you very much. What a wonderful presentation. I think we all learned today about so many topics. We have learned about favelas, we learned about self-construction, about community engagement, about sustainability, about how to strengthen communities, the interrelationship between communities and the establishment, and how communities, the self-building is not only self-building of bricks, but also self-building of networks, of activities, of a sense of belonging. Is wonderful. I hope that everyone that watches this session will share the video with decision makers, elected officials, city staff, with advocates, with the media, with everyone. And I hope that everyone will be back 2 weeks from today, as every other Tuesday, on Cities for Everyone, the webinar. Thanks to Theresa for a magnificent presentation, and thanks for the hundreds of people watching for showing up. Thank you.